Tonight, when someone you love dies, your first instinct is to call people, gather together, arrange a funeral. But have you ever stopped to ask where any of that came from? The rituals, the grief, the idea that something happens after death. When did all of this begin? Because most people assume death rituals came from religion, but science tells a completely different story. Humans were carefully tending to their dead long before they could even speak in full sentences. And what they did was so complex, so deliberate, that modern scientists are still struggling to explain it. So let's go back 300,000 years to a time when death meant something entirely different. Let's start with the oldest discovery, because it rewrote everything we thought we knew. In 2015, deep inside Rising Star Cave in South Africa, scientists found something that stopped them cold. 15 skeletons of Homo naledi, a species that wasn't even our direct ancestor, with a brain roughly the size of an orange, were carefully placed inside a chamber so deep, so dark, so difficult to reach that no predator could have dragged them there. No flood could have carried them. There was only one explanation. Someone had deliberately brought them there. Lee Berger, the lead researcher on the discovery, argued that this suggested intentional burial behavior far older than anyone had imagined. We used to believe that only Homo sapiens, only us, treated our dead as something sacred. Naledi shattered that assumption completely. Treating death as something special wasn't just human. It was almost human. But Homo sapiens took this instinct to an entirely different level. The oldest confirmed human burial site is Qafzeh Cave in Israel, roughly 100,000 years old. Inside, archaeologists found the skeleton of a woman, and beside her, the skeleton of a child, their arms arranged toward each other. Surrounding them were seashells, red ochre pigment, and deer antlers. None of these objects had any practical use. They were placed there because someone believed, or at least hoped, that they might be needed somewhere on the other side. This was the first time we can see, fossilized in stone, a human belief that death is not the end. And that belief did not arrive alone. It arrived with grief. Real, physical, devastating grief. Now you might wonder, grief is an emotion. How do you find it in a fossil record? But anthropologists found a way. In Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal skeleton was discovered in the 1950s, roughly 60,000 years old. Around the body were unusually high concentrations of pollen. So much pollen that the original researcher, Ralph Selecki, concluded that flowers had been deliberately placed around the body. He named the find the flower burial. Later scientists debated whether wind or animals might have brought the pollen in naturally. But what nobody could argue with was something else entirely. This same Neanderthal had old healed fractures throughout his body. He had been severely injured and had survived, which meant someone had taken care of him, fed him, protected him. The grief didn't begin at death. It lived inside every act of care that came before it. So what did ancient humans actually do when someone died? The specifics varied everywhere, but certain patterns repeated themselves across every continent, every culture, every era. The first was protecting the body. Whether they buried it, placed it on an elevated platform, or carefully arranged it in a cave, the universal message was the same. You do not simply abandon the dead. The second was placing objects alongside them. Across Africa, Europe, and Asia, archaeologists consistently find weapons, food, jewelry, and pigment buried with the deceased. These weren't random. They were chosen. The third was gathering. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies show that death was never an isolating event. It was a reason to come together, to sit beside each other, to tell stories about the person who was gone. But the most staggering part of all of this is the afterlife belief, because it is so universal that it starts to feel less like a cultural invention and more like a feature of the human brain itself. Every culture, every continent, every time period has produced some version of the same idea. Death is not the end, something continues. Pascal Boyer, a cognitive anthropologist at Washington University, argues this is not an accident. Our brains are wired for what he calls agent detection. We are constantly scanning our environment for the presence of other minds. This was a survival tool. Hear a rustle in the bushes, assume something is there. If you're wrong, no harm done. If you're right, you just saved your own life. But that same tool, when someone close to you dies, keeps firing. It keeps sensing their presence. It cannot simply erase a mind that has been part of your world for years. And from that cognitive glitch, from that beautiful malfunction, the world's most powerful religions and philosophies were born. Now let's talk about ochre, because it is one of the strangest and most persistent mysteries in all of archaeology. Ochre is a reddish-orange mineral pigment, and it appears at nearly every ancient burial site ever discovered. In Africa, in Europe, in Australia, going back over 100,000 years. Some researchers believe it symbolized blood, life, rebirth, the cycle continuing. Others argue it was used as a preservative, something like an ancient antiseptic. But what is certain is that ochre was deliberately placed on or around the bodies of the dead, consistently across cultures that had no contact with each other. Why would an odorless, tasteless mineral be chosen so universally? Perhaps because red, the most visceral color in the human visual field, communicated something that words at that point in history simply could not. And then came the moment when grief went public in a way that has never been reversed. Roughly 30,000 years ago, in the caves of Europe, handprints began appearing on walls. A person pressed their hand against stone, blew pigment over it, and left a silhouette behind. Some of these handprints are missing fingers. Several researchers believe they were deliberately amputated as part of mourning rituals. A physical piece of yourself, left behind for someone who was gone. This was the first time grief became art, and it never stopped. Memorials, tattoos, photographs, roadside markers, social media posts. We are still doing exactly the same thing. Leaving a mark that says someone was here and someone else misses them. So where does that leave us today? Everything that happens at a modern funeral, the flowers placed beside the body, the objects buried with the dead, the gathering of people, the telling of stories, the quiet insistence that the person is somehow still with us. These are patterns over 100,000 years old. No religion invented them. The human brain invented them because it was built to love, built to lose, and fundamentally incapable of accepting that someone who mattered could simply vanish. Grief is not a malfunction. Grief is proof of love, and that proof, stretching back 300,000 years, is buried carefully in the earth all over this planet, in the form of shells and ochre and flowers and bones arranged just so, left by people who had no written language, no formal religion, and no way of knowing that hundreds of thousands of years later, we would dig them up and finally understand what they were trying to say. We are not the first humans to miss someone. We are just the newest ones in a very long line.